So remember, when we're using the template, Visual Studio includes all kinds of stuff for us. So we're already using Bootstrap and jQuery. So under the www root folder and lib, you can see that we already have these things. We haven't downloaded them, but when we pick that MVC project. So if you don't want to use these things, you don't have to. And if you want to make changes to the CSS, well, here's the site style sheet and there's a site script file. So we can already make some changes to these things if we like. One thing we should probably change in our layout is up here. A couple things are a little bit wonky. One is this doesn't look very good, this COMP2084 get me a game. I want to take out the word COMP2084 and I want to put spaces in here. We also don't really need the home link, do we? Because clicking our project name, this would kind of often be a logo. If we had a logo, it would go here. So if we have a logo, that always takes us to the home page. So we don't really need a separate link in the nav bar called home, kind of wasted. Also, we have a link to the privacy policy in both our header and our footer. Websites never have the privacy policy link in the header. It's always something we just find in the footer. So we'll maybe make a few changes here. And then actually I want to talk about our video game store logo for a minute as well. So I'm going to go back to my layout file. And I'm going to make a few changes. First of all, on line 6, we have a default page title where it actually takes the name of the current page and then our project name. So on home, it just says home page. On privacy, it says privacy policy. And then on shop now. So I want to change the page title. I want to change the logo and get rid of these home and privacy links in our nav bar. So we can do all of these things in the layout file. Up here, I'm going to take out the word COMP2084, and I'm just going to space this out so it is readable to say get me a game. So that's on line 6. You don't have to make any of these changes, but I'm just trying to polish the default template a little bit so that it starts to look a little more like an actual web application. I'm going to do the same thing on line 14. So on line 14, this is our main link, our navbar brand class. So that's on the left side of the navbar and it's in a larger font. I'm going to just change this to say, get me a game. So that just makes it more human readable. Instead of saying COMP2084, get me a game, our site, for now our site logo, even though it's just text, it's not an image, just says get me a game because of this change on line 14. And same in the browser title bar. Now says get me a game. So I have a bonus challenge for you guys, that if you would like to participate, I will make 1 bonus % available to the winner. Here's your challenge. Design a logo for our e-commerce store. So if you want to design a logo to include in our store, what I will challenge you to, which we could then use to replace this get me a game text, which with an actual site logo. If you want to do that, you can email your logo to me before next week's class. In class next week, we can have a little vote, and whoever designs the best logo as voted on by the students in the class, I will give you 1 bonus % on your final grade. Completely optional. You don't have to participate. You probably don't want me designing a logo for your website, for our website. So feel free to try and design a get me a game logo for our store and email it to me and we can have a look at them. I can put them up as a gallery next week and we can vote if anybody wants to do that. And then we can replace this link with an actual logo. I know there are lots of very talented designers in the class. So I also said I wanted to get rid of these two links, the home and privacy links. We don't need them in the header because this is the same as the home link and the privacy link is already in the footer. So we basically just want to link to the home page and shop now as well as register login. So I'm actually going to remove lines 22 down to 27, the two list items that link to home and privacy. So from line 22 down to line 27, I'm just going to delete those things. So right now in our nav UL, we only have one link, that new categories link that we just built. So now my site, when I refresh, we'll just have our homepage link and we have our shop now link. The privacy page still exists, but the link just appears in the footer. I'm also going to just update some text in the footer. This is one of the things I'll want you to do in your assignment, in your project. I'll want you to include your name and student number in the footer, as well as a link to your GitHub repository. So what I'm going to do is down in the footer, I'm going to change this to COMP2084. We'll say at Georgian College. Whoops. So I'll add that into the footer. Again, just making it a little more readable. So my footer looks a little better. And while we're at it, we may as well just jump over to our home page, our main page. And instead of this default text, let's update it to put in a description of what this site actually is. So again, you know, Microsoft's going to give us this template. We're never going to keep this. We're going to want to put in our own homepage content. So if I go to my Solution Explorer, under Views and Home, I'm going to open up Index. And I'm going to change my H1 to say, welcome to the COMP2084 video game shop. Say this site is built in the Monday class using .NET Core and SQL Server. You can put anything you want on here. So now when I load my home page, it actually describes what we're doing. Once I put the site up on GitHub, I'll also include a link to the GitHub repository. So when I click Shop Now, we get this kind of page where all we have is a header, a footer, and static heading. So we're going to work with this page now the rest of the class. We're going to kind of do it in phases. The first phase, we're going to just hard code some links in here to a new page, and we'll look at how those links work. And then we'll mock up some data and we'll replace those links with some dynamic data, even though we're not working with the database for today. So I'm going to go back to my categories index view, this index.cshtml, which should still be open. So I'm going to go back here. And let's just make an unordered list. And in here, let's hard code in a few items. Just put in category 1, category 2, and category 3. So we'll hard code this for now. We'll replace this with some dynamic code afterwards. So I want to make each one of these a link. So this gives us this result. We're just going to get 3 list items as static text on the page. But we want to make these categories links so the user can click on a category, get taken to the next page, and that page will need to pass in the selected category. So we're going to want to wrap each one of these text elements in an anchor tag. So what we're going to do, we'll add an A tag. And inside the anchor tag, we're going to set up the controller and the method. So our controller is going to be categories. We're still working with the category information. And our ASP action, we're going to call a new method. It doesn't exist yet in the controller. We're going to create it in a minute. We're going to call an action called browse. So that's going to make category 1 a link that we'll call our category controller and call a new method we're going to have to write called browse. So if we look at this in the browser, if we just refresh, category 1 should now be something we can click on. So category 1, I can mouse over, it's blue. When I click, I get a blank screen because we do not have a browse method yet. So I want to go back and I want to wrap the other 2 categories in this same link. They're all going to go to the same page. So I'm going to copy that anchor tag. And I'm going to close my second anchor tag. And I'm going to do the same thing. So now I've got 3 links. Okay, I'll show you one other neat little feature Visual Studio has. So when I did this, my LI tag was over here. Let's just do this. Whoops. In terms of formatting your HTML, Visual Studio is a really handy tool. If I highlight everything or click Control A, if I right click, I can choose Format Selection, and it will automatically nest and indent all my tags. So wherever there's nesting, the tag is always indented from the parent tag. So our HTML format is clean and easy to read. So now we've got 3 links. They all call the same method in the categories controller. So if I reload my shop page again, now all 3 of these should be clickable. And they are. So each one of these I can click, and each one of them calls the categories browse method. Only problem is we don't have a categories browse method, so we get a blank screen. So what would we need to do to fix this so that instead of getting a blank screen here, if we click on a category, we actually get a new page to load in the browser. So use the chat or turn on your mic. What's our next step? Yes, a browse thing. Liam, can you be a little more specific? What browse thing do we need? Like a browse, like watercolor called browse? Yes, we need a method and a view. So we need two things called browse. So let's go to the categories controller. Let's create the browse method. And then we need to create the browse view. And then we're going to have to modify the method a little bit. So in our controller, we're going to create a new method. And generally our methods in MVC, they always return this action result, action result. Most of the time, those action results are going to be views, but those action results could also be a JSON object, or it could be something like an HTTP error code, like 404 not found. So we're going to create a method called browse. And as I pointed out last week, the methods always need to start with a capital letter. So you must use a capital B. If you call your method browse with the lowercase, Visual Studio's going to complain. Call your method browse. So if this method should return a view, we're going to use the same code inside the method that we did in our index method that Visual Studio automatically generated. So in here, we'll load the view, views, categories, browse. So we just want to return a view. So the code inside is identical to the code in the index method. We're going to return a view. So now we've done Liam's suggestion. We've written the browse method. So now we can go back to the browser and try our links again. So now when I click on a category, my request takes a minute because so now we get a different error. The browse method does get called, but it's then trying to load one of these three view files. And the default one it looks for is views, categories, browse. We don't have that. We also don't have browse in shared, views shared, or pages shared. So our site errors out. So now we need to create a browse view. Go back to Solution Explorer. And inside of views and categories, we're going to add a new empty view here. So I'm going to right click, views, categories, I'm going to click add, I'm going to click view. Again, I'm going to pick an empty view and I'm going to name it browse. Again, you can omit the extension. The extension will be added automatically for you. You can add the extension if you want. I'm in favor of less typing rather than more. So we'll call the view browse and click add. And if I refresh, my error should go away and we should just get a blank page with our header and footer, but there's no HTML content here yet. So now our error is gone. So let's add a little bit of HTML to our browse page. Again, I can take out the comments at the top. We'll just say you are browsing. For now, we'll just leave it at that. We'll just put on a simple H1. So now when we load the browse page, it just says you are browsing. So this is functioning. We've created links. that call the browse method of our controller. Our controller has a method called browse, and it loads a view also called browse. So this is working. It's functional, but there's one kind of logical problem. What's wrong with this? Or what is this little setup that we've created? What's it missing? Right, all the links work. Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Ivan. Every link is the same. So we want to know on this page, which category are we browsing? So we want to modify, we need to add something unique to each one of these links. They still need to call the browse method, but the browse method needs to know which category the user picked. So first thing we're going to do, we're actually going to, it would be like an ID. Yeah, we don't have IDs in this case. We'll just use text. But normally, yes, it would be an ID. You're right. Exactly right, Hung. So let's go to the categories controller. And in our browse method, we want to modify a little bit. What can we add to the browse method so the browse method will know which category the user picked? Normally, when we have a database, Hung is right, we would have an ID. But what could we pass in instead? Today, we don't have any IDs. Yeah, we could just pass, that's a great idea, Ivan. That's exactly what I was thinking. So if the link says category 1, we want to pass in the text category 1 as a string. So inside our browse method, we're going to add a string parameter. When you're browsing, we need to know which category you want to browse. So we'll put in a string called maybe category name. So when you click browse, you also have to pass in category name. The Visual Studio is complaining because it's saying you've added this parameter, but we're not using it at all. So what we want to do is take the category name passed in with the link and store it in the view bag for display. So we're going to use this view bag option. So this is just kind of an empty container. We can put any values that we want to pass from our controller. If we put it in here, those values are going to be available in the view. I think we did use this briefly last week. So we'll say viewBag.categoryName equals our category name parameter here. So whatever the user clicks, we're then going to store it in the view bag so we can display it back in our browse method. So we've now changed the definition of the browse method. Before it was like index, there were no parameters here. We've now indicated that this method requires a string to be passed into it in order to function, because we want to make each link unique. So I'll leave this code up for a minute, but then we're going to need to change, we need to add something to our links, because all the links call browse, but they're identical. So we're going to need to add a parameter value. So when the link calls browse, the browse method knows which category the user clicked on. So I'll leave this here for another few seconds, and then we're going to jump back to our index view so we can add this category name onto each link. That'll make each link unique. Excuse me. So in our index view, I'm going to add one more thing inside my anchor tags. I'm going to use another ASP directive, and I use ASP root And then I'm going to define our category name. So in this case, category name is going to be category 1. In the second link, our category name parameter is going to be category space 2. And in the third link, the category name will be category 3. So this text here at the end after ASP-root-, this has to match exactly the name of the parameter in the method. So we're passing in a value along on the end of our link. So I'll leave this up for a minute. You can see these. And then we'll see how this works. So when I reload now and click on category 1, notice the URL. It goes to browse, but it passes in category name equals category 1. When I click category 2, we now have this extra piece, these parameters on the end of the URL. That includes the selected category. Category 3 would do the same thing. So we've added this ASP root category name equals to our 3 links. So now they're all calling the browse method, but they're passing along this additional piece of information. Which link did the user click on? So this is working, but we need to do one more thing. So we've modified our method to add a parameter and store it in the view bag. We modified the links, so the links now pass in the category name to the browse method. And those things are working. Oh yes, we could put in the hung, so we could put it in %20. We could also use like HTML encoding. If the %20 is there, that's okay. Depends also what browser you're using, I think. So we should make one change to the browse view. What else should we do here? Because this page is still the same every time. What else do we want to do on this page so we know what category was picked? Yeah, in the browse view, we want to make one more change. We want to add something to the browse view. Right. Okay. So what so what we want different content, right, in the current selection. So we have the content in this object, viewbag.category name. So we want to display this in the browse view. We want it to show up over here in our heading. You are browsing category 3. So in the browse view, inside my H1, if I add a space, and we can use the view bag with our @ symbol, meaning it's a server-side value. So we want to display the selected category in our heading. So now the page content on browse is going to be different each time, depending on which link the user clicks. So now when I pick category 2, comes from the URL parameter to the browse method parameter to the view bag, and now it's displayed on the screen. I pick category 3. So whatever category we pick gets displayed. So we're using the view bag to pass the category name from the controller to the view. So we can display it here. Now there is one way to break this. How could a user break this? Okay, Rudy, a great question. We got the category name here. So when we first created the links, the part I've highlighted in blue, we didn't have it, right? If I just take this out, so this is how we set this page up at the first beginning. We had controller, ASP controller, and ASP action, but we didn't have this at the beginning, okay? So this way, you'll notice on my third link, when I click, just goes to categories browse, because the third link doesn't have this ASP root category. You can see the ASP root category name. So my first two links, they add this to the end of the URL. Rudia, does that answer your question? Okay. So we don't see these words in the browser. This is server-side code. So if I just refresh my shop page for a second and view the source, you'll see these show up as regular links. So those ASP controller, ASP root, and ASP root category name, it gets translated to standard HTML at runtime. These just look like regular links. Yes. Let's see what happens if not, Farouk. So this category name, this piece here I've highlighted in blue, it has to match the parameter name exactly. I'll show you what happens if they don't match. So if I go to my third link, if I don't call this category name, let's say I call this one category ID instead. Okay, let's see what happens. So these are called category name, category name. My method parameter is category name. But here maybe I've called it something else. I've called it category ID. Let's see what happens now when I refresh. So category 1 works. Category 2 works. But category 3, notice it's now passing in a different parameter name called category ID, which our method, our controller, it ignores because there is no parameter called category ID. Okay, so that way this value doesn't display here. So we've sort of broken the page. So the names have to match this ASP root dash, whatever comes after this dash, it has to match the name of our parameter. Yes, that's right. You've got it, Rudia. That's exactly right. Those are really good questions. So it is possible to break this page, isn't it? Right? What if I go like this? If I just click browse, but I take out the parameter, it's blank. Or I do category name equals, and that's also blank. So if we don't have a valid category name here, we don't want to display this message. We want to display something else if the user has changed the URL or not clicked here or not gotten here properly. So we want to add a little bit of logic to this view. We only want to show you our browsing when we have a valid category name. So in our browse page, let's add a little bit of logic. So we'll add some logic. Only show the category if we have a valid category name value. So how can we check? How could we check if there's a category name or not, or if the page looks like this? So we don't want to display this message if we have no category name. So we need a little bit of logic in our view. If there's no category name in the URL, like this, how does my category name show up here? What's the value? So when I pick a link properly, it shows up. If I take the category out of the URL, I get nothing. So we can check this view bag category name. We can check if it's null. If this value is null, we want to give the user a different message. So we can use a little server-side if statement. So if our view bag category name is null, let's say please choose a category, and we'll add a link. To categories to the index method. And that link will just say back. So if we have no category, we want to tell the user, go to the previous page and choose a category. Otherwise, we'll display our H1. So we're only going to show this message you are browsing when we have a category name. So if the user takes that category name out of the URL parameter, they're going to get this message instead. We can try this out quickly. So you can see all the code. So I'll click on shop. I'll pick category 2, and it tells me I'm browsing category 2. If I pick category 3, category 1, all that's working. If I take out the name now, whoops, I have a problem in my link. This should be ASP action. I had ASP root, ASP action. So if I take out my category name, it now tells me to choose a category and jumps me back here. So it's kind of like a little error handler. If our page needs a category and we don't have one, we're going to give the user a different message. We're going to check to make sure that we have a category selected before we show anything on this page. Good question, Diana. I'll show you what this will look like. Let me pull up. I'm going to pull up a project from last year, and I'll show you exactly what that looks like. So here we have, we'll go and look at the categories controller. So in here, we've got a method called edit. So we're going to display a list of categories. The user will click edit beside one, and it will pass in, as Hung suggested earlier, it'll pass in the category ID, the primary key value in the database. So what our code will do, first it will say, if the ID is null, if we don't get a category ID, we're going to send back a 404 error to the user. If we do have an ID number, we're going to query the database and try to find the matching category. If we don't find a category for that ID, like the user in the URL changes it, let's say we have 10 categories, 1 to 10, and the user changes the ID to 800. Well, that's a valid ID. We'll have a value for ID, but that record may not be found in our database. So we're going to run the query and check. And if we don't get any data back for ID 800, again, we're going to return a 404 error. So not found if we have no ID, not found if we have an ID, but the ID is not in our database. And if neither of those things are true, that means we found a match, and we're going to then load the view and return the page. Diana, does that answer your question? And Ivan, that may kind of answer your question as well. So if someone changes the ID parameter, we're going to check. Is there an ID? And then if there is an ID, is that ID valid? So before we send back a view and send back any data, we're going to check both of those scenarios. And this code, most of this code is actually going to be auto-generated by Visual Studio, which is great. We don't even have to write it. Visual Studio is going to write the code for us, which is awesome. Saves us lots of time. What if, okay, so that's around roles and permissions. So we'll look at that later, but it'll be something like this. So again, in the controller, we can control access. Is this particular viewer method public or private? And if it's private, are there particular roles that have access and roles that don't have access? We'll get to this like week 6, 7 of the course. So we would control that through the controller. We would define authentication and authorization. Yeah, it's really simple once we do that. So we'll get there. It's really cool how ASP.NET does it. And again, we don't have to write a lot of code. These things are built in. So this one line of code you're looking at, this means all the methods in this controller are only available to an administrator who is logged in. We just can do that when, about 20 characters, which is great. It's a very good question. Okay, I want to do a little bit more with this today, but I also don't want to kill you guys and make you sit too long. So what I'm going to suggest is let's take another 10-minute break here. I promise that to try and get through the rest of the course in about 20-25 minutes if I can, so I won't be keeping you right till 2 o'clock. Yes, Farouk, I will push this to GitHub at the end and show you how I do that through Visual Studio. But there's one more thing I want to do with it first. So let's take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 1:05 and we'll do those things. Okay, I'm going to step away for a couple minutes.